Good morning, everyone. This is Professor Muhammad Farghal. Today I'm going to talk about speech act theory. Speech act theory was put forward by John Austin back in 1962, and it was spelled out after he died by some of his students who compiled a series of lectures at Oxford. He was a language philosopher at Oxford University. And in his series of lectures, he shifted the interest from logical positivism, the interest in verifying statements and this kind of thing, logical kind of semantics, to ordinary language. He saw that ordinary language is different from what they concentrated on, focusing on whether a statement is true or false and this kind of thing. Analytical sentences and synthetic sentences that can be verified. Instead, he wanted to examine what utterances are produced by people. In other words, he was more interested in ordinary language, and it was a key shift from logical positivism to ordinary language. In order to understand this theory, we have to look at the main concepts in it. First, I'll be looking at the concept of force in this theory, then the concept of performative verbs, next, the types of speech acts, a typology of speech acts, then we'll be looking at felicity conditions, and finally, I'll have a word about direct versus indirect speech acts. First, let's look at the concept of force in this theory. According to Austin, every utterance we produce in the course of communication has three levels of force. First, we have locutionary force. Second, we have illocutionary force. And finally, we have perlocutionary force. Locutionary force refers to the words that are produced in the utterance and what they mean. In other words, the reference here is to the literal meaning of what's said. This may contrast with illocutionary force, which refers to the intended meaning of what's said, what the speaker has on his mind when he says something, rather than what the words in his utterance literally mean. And the third level of force is the perlocutionary force, which refers to the fact that whatever utterance we produce has to cause some consequences in the outside world. And these consequences can be either physical or psychological. Physical, for example, someone running away. Psychological, someone blushing or feeling depressed, having said something. Okay, these are referred to as the perlocutionary force of an utterance. So if we want to give some examples, okay, any utterance, in fact, can be an example. For example, if I say, "Can you please open the door?" Literally, this comes in the form of a question, but it is not interpreted as a question. For example, if the addressee responds by saying, "Certainly," without making a move, to go to the door, this would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? Why? Because in order for this utterance to succeed, the addressee has to get up, go to the door, and open it. Why? Because this utterance should be interpreted as a request rather than as a question. So here we have the speech act of the elocution of requesting rather than the elocution of just questioning. And in terms of perlocutionary force, all right, the physical act here is an immediate consequence of the utterance, which belongs to the perlocutionary force. The fact that the addressee gets up, walks to the door, and opens it. Okay, all this is something that involves physical acts. One could also imagine a psychological kind of perlocutionary force, for example. All right, the way the addressee looks. Is he compatible with the request? All right, some people may not be compatible with when asked to open doors and things like that. So this might show in the way he looks. And so this is something psychological rather than physical. Another example, for example, assuming that you are giving a test, you're watching over your students during a test, and you have just spotted a student looking at his notes or something. Then you go to them and say, you can't do that. All right, you can't do that. This here, we have the elocution of ordering. You are ordering him to not do something. And in terms of perlocutionary act, this might, you might, take possession of the piece of paper from him, all right, snatch it from his hand or what have you. And what about him? He would probably, okay, feel depressed. He might leave the room. He might start crying. All right, whatever the case is, all right, there must be some physical consequences. And all this stuff belongs to the perlocutionary force. So the perlocutionary force would involve both physical action as well as psychological kind of things happening both in the speaker as well as in the addressee. So according to Austin, we have to look at utterances in terms of three levels of force. And it goes without saying that the most important level, according to him, is the elocutionary force. Why? Because this would indicate the elocution of the utterance, and that's where the term speech act comes. Speech act theory refers to the second level of force, the fact that we have elocutions in language, and these elocutions are expressed either explicitly or implicitly in the course of communication. And this brings us to his second distinction between performative utterances and constatives. He started with this key distinction in this theory. But in fact, he was playing cunning. Why? Because later on he abandoned this and he came to the conclusion that every utterance we produce in the course of communication, regardless what it is, if it makes sense, if it is not only noise, if it belongs to a human language, then this utterance is performative. It performs some elocution. And the elocution that's performed is either performed explicitly by a performative verb or implicitly by not using performative verbs. What's the difference between a performative verb and a non-performative verb? Yeah, this is a major concept in this theory. A performative verb is a verb that performs, directly performs the elocution of the atoms. And this class of verbs is rather closed. In other words, we have probably tens of them in a human language. So we have a closed class compared to non-performative verbs, which belong to an open class. Performative verbs are verbs like warn, request, question, condemn, congratulate, promise, apologize. All these are performative verbs. Why? Because they, when we use them, we perform the relevant elocutions. Non-performative verbs would include lots of verbs, for example. Sit, sleep, open, walk, run, etc. and so forth. So all these, right? All these are non-performative. Why? Because they do not represent elocutions. The way, for example, promising represents an elocution, a language function, or condemning, representing a language function, or warning, representing a language function. We can test whether a verb is performative or not. There are, in fact, three conditions on this. A performative verb must be in the present simple. All right. Can be performative only when it's used in the present simple. If it's used in the past tense or in the future, all right, it cannot be performative. That's why, for example, request is a performative verb. So I request you to please open the door. I am using the verb request performatively. Deny is a performative verb. I deny having started the fire. I am using the verb deny performatively. But if I report on someone denying having started the fire, then the verb deny would not be performative. If I said, John denied having started the fire. Here, the verb deny is not performative. It's used to report rather than to perform. Okay, so performative verbs perform elocutions explicitly, but this doesn't mean that we, in the course of communication, we perform elocutions explicitly. In fact, this is the exception rather than the rule. In most cases, we perform elocutions implicitly rather than explicitly. Okay, let me go back to the conditions on performative verbs. So the first condition must be in the present simple. The second condition, it must be in, all right, it must be in the first person, either first person singular or first person plural. Also, it can, all right, this is not completely exclusive. Why? Because it's possible to use a verb performatively when you are referring to an institution in the third person singular. So the third person singular may be used with a performative verb. For example, saying Yarmouk University hereby promises students, or hereby guarantees, or this is quite possible. So when the third person singular stands for an institution or a certain body of X's, then it would be possible to use it with a performative verb. And the third condition is the use of the adverbial hereby. So all performative verbs accept the use of the adverbial hereby, but a non-performative verb cannot accept it. It would be kind of odd to use it with a non-performative verb. That's why I can say, I hereby promise to come to your party, but I cannot, it's not correct to say, I hereby write a letter to my friend. Why? Because write is not performative, but promise is a performative verb. So in order for a verb to be performative, it must be in the present simple, it must be used with the first person, singular or plural, or the third person singular when it refers to a certain body or a certain institution. Now, these, as I have briefly mentioned, these performative verbs, the use of them in the course of communication is not as common as the use of non-performative verbs to perform act, to perform elocutions. This simply means that most of the elocutions we perform in the course of communication, day-to-day communication, embrace utterances that do not feature performative verbs. For example, if we look at the elocution of requesting, all right, in a very formal situation, and I may use the performative verb request to perform this elocution. I request you to please keep quiet, assuming that I'm kind of in a classroom. I'm kind of angry. I have been asking my students to keep quiet, but even I may end up even ordering. Look, I hereby order you to keep quiet. Okay, says order and request from, okay, promise, deny, things like that may be used in formal situations or in emotionally heightened situations. But in principle, we don't use them that frequently in the course of communication. That's why when we perform the diffusion of requesting, we would use the interrogative form rather than using the verb request, performative. Can you please open the door? Open the door, please. The door, please. Will you please open the, or all these perform the elocution of requesting without using the performative verb. So the rule, or commonly in the course of communication, we use implicitly performative sentences. Only in formal situations and emotionally heightened kind of situations, we may opt for using explicit performative utterances, utterances that feature performative verbs. Okay, what types of speech acts do we find in language? All right, there are similar typologies of speech acts, but the one that I feel is good enough to capture most elocutions talks about 5 types of speech acts. The first type is the representative. The representative is a statement in which the speaker commits himself to the truth of what he's saying. So when I say, for example, John is a millionaire, I commit myself to the truth of what I'm saying. And my statement here, my representative, is verifiable. All right. If John is indeed a millionaire, then my statement is true. If not, then my statement is false. So such representatives are verifiable. Of course, we have, all right, under representatives, we have many elocutions. And the most obvious is stating. When you state something, when you, the elocution of saying, the elocution of stating, the elocution of predicting, when you predict something, the elocution of assuming, the elocution of describing. All these produce representatives. And the representatives, just like other speeches, can be either explicitly performative or implicitly performative. For example, John is a millionaire is implicitly performative. It's a representative. And I hereby state to you that John is a millionaire, for example, is an explicitly performative representative. So representatives correspond to what we call in Arabic الجمل الخبرية. When you state something, you commit yourself to the truth of what you're saying. We're not talking about whether you are lying or not, okay? But all right, we are just interested in what you're saying and the fact that it is verifiable. Verifiable, you can examine the outside world in order to prove whether the utterance is true or false. And in fact, this turns out to be the only type of speech act that can be gauged by truth and falsity. This means you can prove whether it's true or false. Let's move on to the second type of speech acts, directives. Directives involve giving directives to the addressee to behave in a certain way, to act in a certain way. That's why they are called directives. And the most obvious illusion here is requesting. When you request someone, you want him to do something for you. Questioning. When you ask someone a question, you want some answer. Warning. When you warn someone, you want them to be aware of some danger. All these are ordering, suggesting. All these involve giving directives to the addressee to act in a certain way. Inviting. You invite someone. All right, you want him to act in a certain way. Suggesting. You act again. You think that's possible for him to act in a certain way. Okay, all these illocutions come under what we call directives. The next involves utterances in which we commit ourselves to performing something in the future. You commit yourself to an act, a future act. And they are called commissives. And the most familiar example here, or the most familiar illocution, is promising. When you promise to do something, what do you do when you promise to do something? You commit yourself to some future act. Pledging. Betting. When you bet, again, you commit yourself to some future act. I'll give you $100 if it rains tomorrow. I have committed myself to some future act. And the next type of speech act is the expressive. And expressives are so familiar in human language. Congratulating, when you congratulate someone. Condemning, when you condemn something. Praising, when you praise something. Complimenting. All these come under expressives. And in expressive, you just express your own feelings towards something. That's why they are called expressives. The fourth type of speech acts okay, so far we have representatives, directives, expressives, and commissives. And so the fifth type here is the declarative. And the term is self-explanatory. The declarative involves declaring something. When you announce something, announcing, declaring, naming, christening, pronouncing some two people, husband and wife, pronouncing. All these involve what we call declaratives. So a declarative must involve an act of announcing something. So, okay, we have these 5 types of speech acts, which I think cover most elocutions in human language. Notice that these elocutions are supposed to be universal. You cannot imagine a language where someone cannot warn another of something, or someone cannot promise another of something. So promising, warning, denying, congratulating. One would assume that these elocutions are universal. But notice that the performative verbs themselves may not be universal. This simply means that in some languages, it's possible that the elocution of denying can only be performed implicitly, but not simply because the language does not have a verb corresponding to the verb deny in English or yunker in Arabic. This doesn't mean that the speakers of that language cannot deny things. They could deny things, but without using a performative verb. I say to you, I did not do it. Well, this is a denial. You are denying something. Right. It's true that in Arabic and English are highly lexicalized. They are highly lexicalized. This means we have many performative verbs that may be used to perform such elocutions in formal and in emotionally heightened situations. But the existence of the performative verb is not universal, but the elocution itself is supposed to be universal. I have one interesting example about Arabic, where we have, for example, usually what's a performative verb in one language is also a performative verb in another language. For example, if the language has a verb for deny, then deny must be performative. If we look at Arabic and English, at a verb like divorce in English, divorce is non-performative, simply because it really does not make sense for someone to tell his wife that I'm divorcing you. I hereby divorce you. Yeah, this is quite ridiculous. Even if said, it would not take effect. It would not be successful. The elocution would not succeed. But in Arabic, the verbal use of the verb corresponding to divorce is performative. So the verb يطلق أو the verbal طالق أنت طالق في الثلاث أنت طالق بالثلاث, or she no longer be his wife. So the verbal act is good enough for the elocution to be successful. This simply means that the verb performative in Arabic, the the verb divorce or the verb يطلق أو the verbal طالق in Arabic is performative, whereas the English verb divorce is not performative. Not that this is the exception rather than the rule. Can we find other examples? And I guess the answer is no. All right, we cannot find an example where simply between English and Arabic, where both of them are highly lexicalized. For example, promising, promise, يعد, dismiss, يطرد. These verbs are performative in both English and Arabic. And here, the verb divorce and its counterpart in Arabic are the exception. Okay, let's move on to the concept of felicity conditions in this theory. I have said that only within the typology of speech acts, only representatives can be judged by truth and falsity. But what about the other types of speech acts? What about directive? What about expressive? What about commissives? What about declaratives? How do we judge them? And the answer is that we judge them in terms of felicity conditions. If they meet the felicity conditions, if the elocution meets all the felicity conditions, then it is felicitous or it is appropriate. So felicity conditions are appropriateness conditions. And they refer to the surrounding circumstances of the elocution. In order for the elocution to be successful, it has to be appropriate within the surrounding circumstances. For example, if we look at this elocution of requesting, in order for this elocution to be successful, it has to meet all the felicity conditions. For example, all right, one felicity condition is that the requested act is not taken care of. Can you request someone to close the door, for example? If the door is already closed, that would be ridiculous. A second felicity condition, the requested act should be within, at least insofar as the speaker believes, should be within the capability of the addressee. You would not ask your mother, assuming that your mother can hardly read and write, you cannot ask her about what's meant by felicity conditions. Would you do that? For example, when you go home, if you've done speech acts at college and you go home, so is it possible for you to ask your mother about felicity conditions? That would be crazy. Why? Because when you request something, then you have the belief that the addressee may be able to fulfill your request or to meet your request. You would not request something that's a matter of course. If something is a matter of course, then you don't want to lose face by requesting it. If you know that your friend is going to lend you money, would you ask him? Would you ask him to lend you money? Why lose face and ask him? All right, because he's going to do this anyway. So this is all right. If it's a matter of course, then something, all right, one would not be, one would not request such a thing. The requested thing should be beneficial for the requester. So, will you request someone to cut your finger? Yeah, that would be crazy. Unless, of course, you've been bitten by a snake and you want him to suck the poison out of your finger. In that case, this is all right. This is appropriate. Why? Because sucking out the poison out of your finger is something that's beneficial to you. So this is a motivated use. And if we look at other elocutions, we find every elocution governed by a set of Felicity conditions. For example, pronouncing the declarative, pronouncing X and Y, husband and wife, X and Y, husband and wife, marrying two people. Can you grab two people in the corridor and pronounce them husband and wife? That would be crazy. All right, it would not take effect. Why? Because authority here, the person who performs this elocution must have the authority to do so. Can you do this in the corridor, assuming that it's a priest doing this? Can the priest grab two people in the corridor and pronounce them husband and wife? And the answer is no. Why? Because the location is also a felicity condition. This must be done at the church rather than in the corridor. The verbal act performed is a felicity condition. For example, can the bridegroom respond to the priest's question, will you thou take thee as blah, blah, blah? Can he respond by saying, yep, or why not? Would that be felicitous? And the answer is no. He has to respond by I will or I do in American English nowadays. So these are felicity conditions on the elocution of pronouncing X and Y, husband and wife. So felicity conditions govern such elocutions other than representative. So it's only representative that can be governed or can be judged by truth and falsity. The other four types of speech acts are governed by felicity conditions. If a felicity condition is violated, then the elocution would not be successful, as simple as that. Okay, finally, let me have a word about something you may come across in the literature on speech acts, direct versus indirect speech acts. This dichotomy refers to the difference between form and function, and in fact, it goes back to the fact that in natural language, in all human languages, we have three moods. We have the indicative mood, we have the interrogative mood, and we have the imperative mood. These three moods are common in all human languages. We cannot find a language where someone cannot request or cannot order using the imperative form, or cannot question using the interrogative form, or cannot state using the indicative form. So here, this distinction has to do with whether the elocution is performed using the indicative mood, the interrogative mood, or the imperative mood. If, for example, if you are ordering and you are using the indicative, if the indicative mood, then you are, all right, you have an indirect speech act. For example, I want you out of this room immediately. I am using the indicative mood here. But am I stating? And the answer is no, I'm not stating, I am ordering. So I want you out of this room immediately here, perform the elocution of ordering, and it is an indirect speech act. By contrast, if I use the imperative mood, then I would be performing the same elocution directly. Get out of here. Here I am using the imperative mood and I am performing the elocution of ordering directly rather than indirectly. So this distinction has to do with the correspondence between form and function. If there's correspondence between form and function, the form of the utterance and the way it functions, then it is a direct speech act. If there is no correspondence between them, if the form is one thing and the function or the elocution is another, then we have an indirect speech act. For example, in requesting, can you please open the door? This is an indirect speech act. Why? Because I am using the interrogative form to perform the elocution of requesting. But if I am using the imperative form, then I am performing the elocution directly and I produce a direct speech act. Open the door, please, is a direct speech act, whereas can you please open the door is an indirect speech act. Okay, I think I have covered 5 basic concepts which are necessary for understanding speech act theory. Without understanding these concepts, one cannot, in fact, conceptualize this theory. The concept of force, the fact that every utterance has 3 levels of force: locutionary force, illocutionary force, and perlocutionary force. The fact that we have performative verbs and non-performative verbs is a key concept in this theory. Types of speech acts. The fact that we have 5 types of speech acts, only one of them representative can be gauged by truth and falsehood. The others must be judged in terms of felicity conditions. Then we have felicity conditions, which refer to the surrounding circumstances of an utterance. In order for the utterance to be successful, in order for the elocution to be successful, it must meet all the felicity conditions. And finally, we have looked at direct versus indirect speech acts, which can be traced back to the distinction between 3 moods in human language: the indicative mood, the interrogative mood, and the imperative mood. That's it for today. Thank you very much and goodbye.